Tynan Portillo presents, featuring the best horror stories of the 19th century. Welcome to the Poe Show podcast. Narrated by Tynan Portillo. Today's episode, The Unnatural Mother by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, with guest narrator, Sara McDonald.
"Don't tell me,"
said old Miss Briggs, with a forbidding shake of the head.
"No mother that was a mother would desert her own child for anything on earth. And leaving it a care on the town, too,"
put in Susanna Jacobs.
"as if we hadn't enough to do to take care of our own."
Miss Jacobs was a well-to-do old maid, owning a comfortable farm and homestead, and living alone with an impoverished cousin acting as general servant, companion, and protege. Miss Briggs, on the contrary, had had 13 children, 5 of whom remained to bless her, so that what maternal feeling Miss Jacobs might lack, Miss Briggs could certainly supply. "I should think," piped little Martha Ann Simmons, the village dressmaker, "that she might have saved her young one first and then tried what she could do for the town." Martha had been married, had lost her husband, and had one sickly boy to care for. The youngest Briggs girl, still unmarried at 36, and in her mother's eyes a most tender infant, now ventured to make a remark. "You don't any of you seem to think what she did for all of us. If she hadn't left hers, we should have all lost ours sure."
"You ain't no call to judge, Maria Malaya,"
her mother hastened to reply.
"You've no children of your own, and you can't judge of a mother's duty. No mother ought to leave her child, whatever happens. The Lord gave it to her to take care of. He never gave her other people's. You needn't tell me. She was an unnatural mother,"
repeated Miss Jacobs harshly.
"as I said to begin with." "What is the story?"
asked the city boarder. The city boarder was interested in stories from a business point of view, but they did not know that.
"What did this woman do?"
There was no difficulty in eliciting particulars. The difficulty was rather in discriminating amidst their profusion and contradictoriness. But when the city boarder got it clear in her mind, it was somewhat as follows. The name of the much-condemned heroine was Esther Greenwood, and she lived and died here in Toddsville. Toddsville was a mill village. The Todds lived on a beautiful eminence overlooking the little town, as the castles of robber barons on the Rhine used to overlook their little towns. The mills and the mill hands' houses were built close along the bed of the river. They had to be pretty close because the valley was a narrow one, and the bordering hills were too steep for travel, but the water power was fine. Above the village was the reservoir, filling the entire valley save for a narrow road beside it, a fair blue smiling lake, edged with lilies and blue flag, rich in pickerel and perch. This lake gave them fish, it gave them ice, it gave the power that ran the mills, that gave the town its bread. Blue Lake was both useful and ornamental. In this pretty and industrious village, Esther had grown up, the somewhat neglected child of a heartbroken widower. He had lost a young wife and 3 fair babies before her. This one was left him, and he said he meant that she should have all the chance there was.
"That was what ailed her in the first place,"
they all eagerly explained to the city boarder.
"She never knew what 'twas to have a mother, and she grew up a regular tomboy. Why, she used to roam the country for miles around in all weather, and her father wouldn't take no advice."
This topic lent itself to eager discussion. The recreant father, it appeared, was a doctor, not their accepted standby, the resident physician of the neighborhood, but an alien doctor, possessed of views.
"You never heard such things as he advocated. He wouldn't give no medicines hardly, said nature did the curing. He couldn't. And he couldn't either. That was clear. Look at his wife and children dying on his hands, as it were. Physician, heal thyself, I say.
But Mother, Maria Amelia put in, she was an invalid when he married her, they say. And those children died of what's that thing that nobody can help?
That may all be so. But all the same, it's a doctor's business to give medicine. If nature was all that was wanted, we needn't have any doctor at all. I believe in medicine, and plenty of it. I always gave my children a good clearance, spring and fall, whether anything ailed them or not, just to be on the safe side. And if there was anything the matter with them, they had plenty more. I never had anything to reproach myself with on that score.
Then, as a sort of concession to the family graveyard, she added piously,
The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. You should have seen the way he dressed that child. It was a reproach to the town. Why, you couldn't tell at a distance whether it was a boy or a girl, and barefoot. He let that child go barefoot till she was so big we was actually mortified to see her.
It appeared that a wild, healthy childhood had made Esther very different in her early womanhood from the meek, well-behaved damsels of the little place. She was well enough liked by those who knew her at all, and the children of the place adored her, but the worthy matrons shook their heads and prophesied no good of a girl who was queer. She was described with rich detail in reminiscence, how she wore her hair short till she was 15.
Just shingled like a boy's. It did seem a shame that girl had no mother to look after her. And her clothes was almost a scandal, even when she put on shoes and stockings. Just gingham, brown gingham, and short.
I think she was a real nice girl, said Maria Amelia. I can remember her just as well. She was so nice to us children. She was 5 or 6 years older than I was, and most girls that age won't have anything to do with little ones. But she was as kind and pleasant. She'd take us berrying and on all sorts of walks, and teach us new games and tell us things. I don't remember anyone that ever did us the good she did. Maria Amelia's thin chest heaved with emotion, and there were tears in her eyes. But her mother took her up somewhat sharply.
That sounds well, I must say. Right before your own mother that's toiled and slaved for you. It's all very well for a young thing that's got nothing on earth to do to make herself agreeable to young ones. That poor blinded father of hers never taught her to do the work a girl should. Naturally, he couldn't. At least he might have married again and given her another mother,
said Susanna Jacobs with decision. With so much decision, in fact, that the city boarder studied her expression for a moment and concluded that if this recreant father had not married again, it was not for lack of opportunity. Miss Simmons cast an understanding glance upon Miss Jacobs and nodded wisely.
Yes, he ought to have done that, of course. A man's not fit to bring up children anyhow. How can they? Mothers have the instinct, that is, all natural mothers have. But, dear me, there's some as don't seem to be mothers, even when they have a child. You're quite right, Miss Simmons. It's a divine instinct, I say. I'm sorry for the child that lacks it. Now this Esther, we always knew she wasn't like other girls. She never seemed to care for dress and company and things girls naturally do, but was always philandering over the hills with a parcel of young ones. There wasn't a child in town but would run after her. She made more trouble than a little in families. The young ones quoting what Aunt Esther said and telling what Aunt Esther did to their own mothers, and she only a young girl. Why, she actually seemed to care more for them children than she did for Beau or anything. It wasn't natural. But she did marry. Marry? Yes, she married finally. We all thought she never would, but she did. After the things her father taught her, it did seem as if he'd ruined all her chances. It's simply terrible the way the girl was trained. Him being a doctor made it different, I suppose. Doctor or no doctor, it was a crying shame to have a young girl so instructed. Maria, Malaya, I want you should get me my smelling salts. They're up in the spare chamber, I believe. When your Aunt Marcia was here, she had one of her spells. Don't you remember? And she asked for salts. Look in the top bureau drawer. They must be there.
Maria Amelia, 36, but unmarried, withdrew dutifully, and the other ladies drew closer to the city border.
It's the most shocking thing I ever heard. Do you know he, a father, actually taught his daughter how babies come?
There was a breathless hush.
He did. All the particulars. It was perfectly awful. He said that he expected her to be a mother and that she ought to understand what was before her. He was waited on by a committee of ladies from the church, married ladies, all older than he was. They told him it was creating a scandal in the town. And what do you think he said?
There was another breathless silence. Above, the steps of Maria Amelia were heard, approaching the stairs.
It ain't there, Ma.
Well, you look in the highboy and in the top drawer. They're somewhere up there.
Then, in a sepulchral whisper,
He told us, yes, ma'am, I was on that committee. He told us that until young women knew what was before them as mothers, they would not do their duty to choosing a father for their children. That was his expression, choosing a father. A nice thing for a young girl to be thinking of, a father for her children. Yes, and more than that,
inserted Miss Jacobs, who, though not on the committee, seemed familiar with its workings.
he told them,
But Miss Briggs waved her aside and continued swiftly.
he taught that innocent girl about the bad disease. Actually, he did. It got out, too, all over town. There wasn't a man here who would have married her after that.
Miss Jacobs insisted on taking up the tale.
I understand that he said it was to protect her. Protect her, indeed, against matrimony. As if any man alive would want to marry a young girl who knew all the evil of life. I was brought up differently, I assure you. Young girls should be kept innocent.
Miss Briggs solemnly proclaimed.
Why, when I was married, I knew no more what was before me than a babe unborn, and my girls were all brought up so, too.
Then, as Maria Amelia returned with the salts, she continued more loudly.
But she did marry after all, and a mighty queer husband she got, too. He was an artist of something, made pictures for the magazines and such as that, and they do say she met him first out in the hills. That's the first was known of it here, anyhow. Them two traipsing about all over, him with his painting things. They married and just settled down to live with her father, for she vowed she wouldn't leave him. And he said it didn't make no difference where they lived. He took his business with him.
They seemed very happy together, said Maria Amelia.
Happy? Well, they might have been, I suppose. It was a pretty queer family, I think.
And her mother shook her head in retrospection.
They got on all right for a while, but the old man died, and those two, well, I don't call it housekeeping the way they lived. No, they spent more time out of the doors than they did in the house. She followed him around everywhere, and for open love-making.
They all showed deep disapproval at this memory, all but the city boarder and Maria Amelia.
She had one child, a girl, and it was just shocking to see how she neglected that child from the beginning. She never seemed to have no maternal feeling at all. But I thought you said she was very fond of children. Oh, children, yes. She'd take up with any dirty-faced brat in town, even to them Canucks. I've seen her again and again with a whole swarm of the mill hands, young ones round her, going on some picnic or other. Open-air school, she used to call it. Such notions as she had. But when it come to her own child, why, she never had no baby clothes for it. Not a single sock. Why? What did she do with the little thing? The Lord knows. She never would let us hardly see it when 'twas little. Shame, too, I don't doubt. But that's strange feelings for a mother. Why, I was so proud of my babies, and I kept 'em looking so pretty. I'd have sat up all night and sewed and washed, but I'd have had my children looking well.
And the poor old eyes filled with tears as she thought of the 8 little graves in the churchyard, which she never failed to keep looking pretty even now.
She just let that young one roll around in the grass like a puppy with hardly nothing on. We all done what we could, of course. We felt it no more'n right, but she was real hateful about it, and we had to let her be. The child died? Died? Dear, no. That's it you saw going by. A great strapping girl she is, too, and promising to grow up well, thanks to Mrs. Stone's taking her. Mrs. Stone always thought a heap of Esther. It's a mercy to the child that she lost her mother, I do believe. How she ever survived that kind of treatment beats all. Why, that woman never seemed to have the first spark of maternal feeling to the end. She seemed just as fond of the other young ones after she had her own as she was before, and that's against nature. The way it happened was this. You see, they lived up the valley nearer to the lake than the village. He was away and was coming home that night, it seems, driving from Drayton along the lake road, and she set out to meet him. She must have walked up to the dam to look for him, and we think maybe she saw the team clear across the lake. Maybe she thought he could get to the house and save little Esther in time. That's the only explanation we could ever put on it. But this was what she did. And you can judge for yourselves if any mother in their senses could have done such a thing. You see, 'twas the time of that awful disaster. You've read of it, likely, that destroyed 3 villages. Well, she got to the dam and see that 'twas giving way. She was always great for knowing all such things. And she just turned and ran. Jake Elder was up on the hill after a stray cow, and he seen her go. He was too far off to imagine what ailed her, but he said he never saw a woman run so in his life. And if you'll believe it, she ran right by her own house. Never stopped, never looked at it, just run for the village. Of course, she may have lost her head with fright, but that wasn't like her. No. I think she had made up her mind to leave that innocent baby to die. She just ran down here and give warning, and of course, we sent word down valley on horseback, and there was no lives lost in all 3 villages. She started to run back as soon as we was roused, but 'twas too late then. Jake saw it all, though he was too far off to do a thing. He said he couldn't stir a foot. It was so awful. He seen the wagon driving along as nice as you please till it got close to the dam, and then Greenwood seemed to see the danger and whipped up like mad. He was the father, you know, but he wasn't quite in time. The dam give way and the water went over him like a tidal wave. She was almost to the gate when it struck the house and her, and we never found her body nor his for days and days. They was washed clear down river. Their house was strong, and it stood a little high and had some big trees between it and the lake, too. It was moved off the place and brought up against the side of the stone church down yonder, but 'twa'n't wholly in pieces. and that child was found swimming round in its bed, most drowned, but not quite. The wonder is, it didn't die of a cold, but it's here yet. Must have had a strong constitution. Their folks never did nothing for it, so we had to keep it here.
Well now, Mother, said Maria Amelia Briggs, it does seem to me that she did her duty. You know yourself that if she hadn't give warning, all 3 of the villages would have been cleaned out, a matter of 1,500 people. And if she'd stopped to look that child, she couldn't have got here in time. Don't you believe she was thinking of those mill hands' children?
Maria Malaya, I'm ashamed of you. But you ain't married and ain't a mother. A mother's duty is to her own child. She neglected her own to look after other folks. The Lord never gave her them other children to care for. Yes, and here's her child, a burden on the town. She was an unnatural mother.
All right. Hello from the Poe Show. I am your host, Tynan Portillo, and I have here our guest narrator, my mother, Sara McDonald. Why don't you say hi, Mom?
Hi, Tynan.
You can say hi to the listeners or hi to anyone in specifics. Like, you want to say hi to your husband?
Oh, hi, Clinton.
Okay. Thank you so much for doing this episode of the Poe Show with me. It was a lot of fun to get to work with you. It was a lot of fun to be able to do an episode with my mom. And I hope that you had a fun time as well. Yes, no?
I think I taught you patience.
I think we had a fun time. Look, I mean, this was your first time doing voiceover anything before, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but like you're an actress, you're a singer, and you've been doing that for most of your life on stage, right?
Yes.
Give people a little bit of your background.
Okay, I don't know.
Well, like you went to college for this stuff, right?
Yeah, I guess I've loved to sing since I was a little girl. I wanted to sing in the Paris Opera House and studied at Brigham Young University for a few years in music. And then I decided to do some other things with my life. I had a wonderful son. And then I ultimately became a teacher, a special education teacher.
Yeah.
So I did not sing in the Paris Opera House. Still a dream.
You can do that. You can still do it.
You have a lot of faith in your mom. But I love what I do, and I do theater and things for fun now, for fun and for pay, which is always fun.
Thank you again for coming on for this episode of the podcast. I wanted to do this one because it does talk about motherhood, and I guess I'll just summarize the story real quick, and then we'll get into some questions. So The Unnatural Mother follows a group of women talking about a girl that they thought was an unnatural mother. Her name is Esther. And throughout the story, we see that they talk about Esther having a single father because her mother died due to some form of disease. She was an invalid when the father met her. And the father believed that a girl should know certain things as a doctor. So he taught her how babies come, right? And taught her about how to choose a good father, for her children or a good husband. And they all thought that that was terrible and taboo. And then we get to Esther being a grown woman, having a husband, and they were into open lovemaking. Of course, back in the 1800s, that just meant courtship or giving gifts or showing some sign of affection. It did not mean what it means today. And then one day, Esther is walking to meet her husband, who's coming back home from some business trip. And what are you doing?
Sorry, you're telling a story.
You're just like moving your glasses in front of your eyes and you're like, ooh. Okay. And so
arms.
then Esther sees that the dam that is above 3 different villages is about to burst. And I think it's interesting that we hear this account from someone named Jake. He's up on the hill, and we don't know who he is. He never comes up again. But I also wonder, why didn't he do anything to try and help? Anyway, it just says like, oh, he couldn't do anything. It was so awful. It's like, he seems like a coward to me. Anyway, she runs to the village past her home, thereby leaving her child unattended, and warns her village so that they can warn the other villages and get everyone out in time before it floods. Then she runs back to meet her husband, again running past her house, not grabbing her child, and her husband are swept away by the flood. And now the women of this village, instead of being grateful to Esther for having warned the village of the flood, instead choose to insult her and kind of spit on her grave by saying she was an unnatural mother for not looking after her own child. So that's the story of the unnatural mother. And I just thought it was kind of in theme to have my mom come on and help me with this episode, and also to post it during May, when we have Mother's Day coming. So I did like what Charlotte Perkins Gilman had to say about motherhood in this story. And I'm sorry, Mom, I want to ask you more questions. Do you mind if I just clarify some things for the listeners real quick?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. I want to get to asking you questions, but I feel the accountability to have to share some things. I have learned some more about Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, I thought she was just a feminist and actually really respected her. It turns out she was also quite racist. She was a self-described nativist, and that meant that she believed people born in her nation, meaning the U.S., as well as of her bloodline, were superior to those of immigrants or minorities. And she was a pioneer for feminism. She wrote Women in Economics, a study of the economic relation between men and women as a factor in social evolution. That was groundbreaking in finally studying and giving a voice to women's oppression. So I think we can applaud that because the movement and those actions in themselves are bigger than her. But she also was a nativist and talked about English-born babies being better bred than other races. She also was calling Black Americans, quote, a large body of aliens whose skin color made them widely dissimilar and in many respects inferior to Caucasians. She proposed that those Black Americans who were not self-supporting or who were, again, quote, actual criminals, which she clearly distinguished from the, quote, decent, self-supporting, progressive Negroes, could be forcibly enlisted into a quasi-military state labor force. And the essay which she wrote for the American Journal of Sociology was titled A Suggestion on the Negro Problem. So obviously very racist, and it came from that nativist belief, which is also why she supported feminism, because she was able to still keep in mind that idea of women needing to be equal, but it was only women of her race and of her nation. And that because I was thinking that was kind of a contradiction to think about, how could you say women are oppressed and these minorities are oppressed, but we only need to help one of them? It came from that limiting belief. But Halle Butler, a writer from the Paris Review magazine, wrote an article titled The Trouble with Charlotte Perkins Gilman, in which she states about Gilman, put bluntly, she was a Victorian white nationalist. And Kathlleen Cooey, I believe, from the University of Chicago's Woman is a Rational Animal, says about Gilman, quote, in summary, Gilman's advocacies for gender equality and racial inequality, which may initially appear at odds to a contemporary reader, Both stemmed from and sought a common landing pad in her fundamental nationalist desire for a particular and homogeneous nationalist desire for a particular and homogeneous citizenry. So I did feel the need to share that with the readers and the listeners of this podcast so that they have a full scope of who the authors are on this podcast. You know, I've said similar things about H.P. Lovecraft, so I feel the need to just clarify that before we go on. All right, so on to the questions. So, Mom, reading this story and knowing how these women describe a woman who kind of abandoned her child for the betterment of her community. This is a story showing how cruel women can be to women. So why do you think this happens?
I've always wondered that. You know, my mom always said it's jealousy. It's women being jealous of others. I'm like, why do we have to be jealous when we're so powerful and have such powerful thoughts and feelings? Like, why don't we band together and support each other? Mm-hmm. But it seems that somehow we are, and it's kind of a generic we, right? But comparing each other, maybe socially we're always comparing each other, like women against each other. And so if we feel inadequate in some way, it's somehow we have to pull someone else apart or take them down to.
Yeah.
In this situation, it seems to be that, like, really, she saved a town. She saved their babies. Mm-hmm. You know, she didn't ever not try to save her. She just never got the opportunity, and they're judging her for it. And
I think it's interesting to note that Malia, or Amelia, however you want to say it, she said it both ways in the story, but she mentioned, she's like, hey, you know, don't you think she knew what she was doing? Because considering the fact that she knew her house, she knew there were trees in between it and the lake, and it was a strong house, Esther probably knew that her baby was going to be safe, that it was in a strong house, it was going to be taken care of, and if anything happened, someone of the town could look after her child. And so she went over and quote-unquote abandon her child in order to save the community. And I think it really speaks to sometimes the need to leave someone you love to give them a better opportunity or chance sometimes. Because Charlotte Perkins Gilman had this similar experience to where she was married, had a daughter, and her husband divorced. Husband got remarried, and then Charlotte was going to pursue a career in Chicago, and she said, I can't raise a daughter on my own, and I don't want to do it in Chicago. So she gave custody of her daughter to her husband, her ex-husband, and his new wife. And so she was criticized and called an unnatural or a bad mother for allowing her daughter to be raised by another woman. Mm-hmm. And I take away from it as a reader that she knew what she was doing, Esther, and Esther left her baby there because she knew that it was not in harm's way. But talking more about why women possibly be so cruel to other women, you know, it's kind of a stereotype, isn't it?
Yeah.
Of like backbiting each other. And I mean, I've talked to Madison about this too. Madison was on an episode of this podcast as well. Mm-hmm. She was in The Dream by Mary Shelley. And she said it's patriarchy. And I don't know entirely if it is, because the way she talked about it, she said there are patriarchal power systems which women were able to get power in, and like by impressing men. And therefore, they want to keep that power, so they keep other women down because it is a form of power.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Like, what do you think about that?
It's so hard because sometimes I don't understand the trust that is broken sometimes by women. So maybe I haven't thought that deeply about it. I just try to be kind and trusting of my own friends and females that I'm around, and think the best of them and hope they do of me. And when it doesn't turn out well, it is kind of a question to me, like, why did that person turn on me for some reason? And I don't think I've ever been able to answer that.
Yeah. It's interesting because I feel like the stereotype is like if men have a problem, what do? They go and they physically fight
it out. Yeah.
But-
and females were so relational in our relationships. You know, it's so much easier in my mind, it's so much easier to hurt someone by the things that you say, whether you do it on purpose or not.
So, having read as these characters, who is the worst character in this story? Because we have Mrs. Briggs being the old cynical one. We have Susanna Jacobs being more of the kind of like the second hand to Mrs. Briggs, you know, kind of flippant, but still reinforcing those same ideas. Maria Amelia is obviously the one defending Esther. And it kind of seemed like she was saying that Esther was more of a mother than Mrs. Briggs. A couple other characters, like the city boarder, right?
Yeah.
Who's just like, no, what's going on? Tell me.
Maybe the city boarder is the worst character. I don't know. I guess that's the old lady seems to be throwing around her influence in a negative way. You know, spreading gossip to the border
and why do you think these women feel the need to talk about Esther this way? Because again, they could have taken it as Esther saved all of us, as Maria Amelia states in the story, like she saved all of us, saved 3 villages. But these women are choosing to talk about this dead woman who saved all of them. They're choosing to talk about her in a negative light. Why do you think they're doing that? Do you think that they feel ashamed of their own ability to raise children, or feel like, oh, well, I would have saved my child and everyone else would have died, so therefore I feel less righteous?
I think that perhaps they couldn't have done it themselves. They couldn't have sacrificed their own child. Maybe this goes back to, you know, the authors. Like maybe that's how she felt. She was judged. Maybe it goes back to what she was dealing with and what she felt like society, how it was making her feel.
Right, but why would they be so spiteful?
Well, I'm just thinking that a lot of women in my own experience in these type of situations, like gossipy situations, stuff, sometimes this stems from strong religious beliefs. I keep thinking, like, could this have some religious background to it? Like
I guess that's a good question. If there's some, because it doesn't state the religion of these people, but of course they say like Lord knows, right? So it's in my eyes, and according to Charlotte's background, it's probably some form of Christian. But then I guess you could also, with that religious background, ask, well, then what did God do with his only son?
Right, and what did he ask? Like, it wasn't Isaac, but it was dad.
Abraham.
Thank you.
Abraham.
Thank you. But what did he ask? You know, what did he ask Abraham to do?
Yeah. So then, in that light, we have, hey, Esther abandoned her child for the betterment of the community, so everyone else could live, right?
Yeah. But then she's judged as that being awful.
Right. So then, is this also possibly a criticism of, well, if you're going to criticize me, then you better criticize God, right? And saying that to religious zealots, because that's saying, well, God abandoned his only begotten son for the betterment of the entire world, and he turned out okay, right? He rose, and now he's back with his father. So you better criticize God if you're going to criticize me. Do you think that could also be an underlying theme in this poem? In this work?
I suppose it does depend on the actual reader, too.
Yeah.
Right? What you're going to take from it, because...
And that's why we discuss all these things.
Yeah, and I feel like that maybe comes from the way I was raised, you know, very strict type religion, and thinking about that sacrifice, like that's like the greatest sacrifice. That's like the greatest thing, like to give up your child. But why? Why is that the greatest sacrifice? Like maybe it's the greatest sacrifice to not give up your child. So I guess I could see both sides of that.
Yeah, that's why we discuss this, because it's interesting to think about all of that, right? You adding that religious perspective to this conversation has made me think like maybe Charlotte, with her background and with, I'm sure, religious zealots criticizing her and saying that she was maybe an ungodly mother, maybe she was also offering this as a comparison and saying, well, look at, the role model that we're supposed to be modeling ourselves after. He did the same thing, kind of thing. But who knows, right? It's just like you said, it's up to the reader. So as a reader, and even as a narrator for this story, did you get any strong impressions while reading or narrating? Anything that jumped out to you? Any themes, any characters, any stories or people that you related to? Anything at all?
Maybe the unnatural mother, in the sense that I'm not saying I'm some kind of hero or anything like that. Because I see her as a hero. Oh my God.
But you are.
Whatever.
No, you are. I've talked about this before on the podcast, but you did make sacrifices for me. You were out on your own. You were a single mother for a long time. You left a terrible relationship and only did it for me. You've told me multiple times that you've only done it for me. You would never have done it for yourself. So you are a hero.
Oh, I don't know. But I guess, sorry. I guess impressions of, thanks, being that person that people don't understand because they don't know what you're going through, and they judge you because they only see one side of the story. And I think that's, and again, they're socially just so, maybe even religiously, but socially just so programmed to think a certain way. I've got to think of the time period, and I didn't live at this time period, but maybe being in those kind of situations where you really need that sisterhood or those women, and they're not there for you because for some reason they're judging the situation that you're dealing with. So I guess I felt that strong impression as I read it. I was like, ugh, this is a bummer. This has been going on forever, for too long.
Yeah. Well, did you have a favorite part of the story?
I think my favorite part of the story is where I like when the old lady said or described the little girl, still alive, rolling around in her crib. And I kind of was like, nah. Like, see?
Yeah.
She was right. She was right about her house was standing long enough that her daughter could survive, and that her daughter was strong enough to make it through even without her.
Yeah. Acknowledgement that she was right, and that all of these ladies, even though they're saying how wrong she was right, and they can't change that. So why do you think the townspeople alienate Esther in general? Of course, we hear the women talking about, she learned how babies come. She learned about the bad disease from her father, and she had tomboy-like hair. Do you think it was just associated with the kind of groupthink of social standards back then?
I absolutely think they alienate her because she's different, because of her how she's raised, and that she's embracing nature and all of that around her, and understanding things that they weren't allowed to understand when they were children, that they weren't brought up to understand, that they would never teach there. So that goes back to, again, the social standard.
Well, yeah, it's super interesting to me that women's fashion in the past 100 years, I think has changed more than once each decade. You see swimsuits and dresses and all of that change more, especially with women's body types. Like the ideal woman's body has changed more than once each decade. So it's like very volatile what our image is of someone who is ideal, or someone who is healthy, or someone who is blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And back during this time, in Charlotte's lifetime, so Charlotte was alive until around World War I, and just the times and the knowledge and everything back then, we made some socially really great strides in that time since the 1900s, but it has been such great strides that it's been scary to a lot of people, right? Like women being able to vote, getting the pill, being able to get a credit card, without approval from a husband. Like that was just the 70s from my memory, is that women could only get a credit card in the 70s without a man's permission.
Wow.
So I think it's just interesting to see in this story that there are social standards that say children, let alone women, should not learn how babies come.
No,
right?
You just have to figure it out. Not that you can't, but
right.
Wow, that's terrifying.
Yeah, because then what happens is you have your wedding night and it's like, we don't know what to do. And so I think partially the social standards of the day are why they alienated her, but it's interesting to see how social standards of the day change so quickly and so immensely. I mean, you could apply that for any situation. Did you connect to this story personally in any way or to any character?
I guess I kind of mentioned that earlier, and feeling some sort of camaraderie or understanding of the character Esther not being accepted and being alienated for many reasons. Of course, I wasn't alienated like for the same reasons, but I think that...
Well, but that alienation can come in different forms, but still be the same feeling and still be the same isolation from humanity.
Yeah.
Because maybe you don't have a popular belief, or it's really interesting how if someone, like, for instance, in Hollywood tries something new, it then becomes a standard if it catches on. Like, you know the pick-me girl kind of stereotype?
No.
So the pygmy girl is like a girl who's like one of the guys. So she'll hang out with the guys. She'll get drunk with the guys. And, hey, I'm one of the boys, right?
Yeah.
But the whole intention behind that is that one of the boys will want to sleep with her. That's what a pygmy girl is. Like, you can go have a night out with the boys. That's fine. I'm not gonna nag you. I'm not gonna ask you where you were, right? It's a pygmy girl.
Isn't that a social stereotype, though?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
But that came around during the 90s and 2000s when you had the girl who was maybe kind of socially awkward and just not like the other girly girls show up to prom in the movie in Converse and a short dress and cut her hair.
Oh, those were our favorite movies.
Right.
Because she beat everyone.
Yes. But the thing is, that has now turned into a pick-me girl. And now tons of women and tons of people in general hate that and can see through that kind of thing. But it was new back in the 90s and 2000s.
Yeah.
And so it caught fire. People liked it. And then it just kind of it was stretched so far, so thin in so many movies that now it's a negative stereotype.
Oh,
it's like an 80s action hero where it's like, oh, I got big muscles. I'm going to break down a door. I'm going to shoot everyone from the hip, right? Not even aiming, and I'm going to kill everybody. And now we see that as very cheesy. Back in the 80s, it was awesome.
Oh, yeah.
But now it's seen as cheesy and over the top and more like an 80s action film.
I see. Okay. I'm just out of the loop. I'm like, do what?
Well, I mean,
This is unfortunate because I teach high school, and so they can run right over me, and I have no idea what they just said.
Well, and I stay up to date just by watching YouTube meme compilations, so I know what's going on there, skibbity toilet and all that crap.
God.
But it's actually funny because I was supposed to serve jury duty. They were asking me to serve jury duty, and they said, "So where do you get your main news from?"
Oh my!
And so I said, "YouTube and the BBC." And I wasn't called. I wasn't.
It worked. Yeah, I bet. Shoot.
So do you have any female role models or favorite female authors? Any women that you look up to and find to be an inspiration?
My mom. My mom is one of my female role models for sure. Just watching her whole life experience and the struggles that she overcame and the example that she was and continues to try to be for me. My mom is a role model for me.
That's great.
Favorite authors. I'm horrible with names.
What did they write?
I'm a sucker for all the Jane Austen stuff. I grew up on all those kind of old romance, Villette and Emma, and I mean, Villette wasn't written by one of the Austen sisters, but all of those love stories. Because I mean, I'm a '90s girl, so I was raised on the princess. You know, what do they call that?
Okay, so are you talking about like Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella? No. I ask because Sleeping Beauty for me is always going to be a favorite. One of my films.
Shut up! That is your mother's favorite.
Really?
You do not love Sleeping Beauty.
I do. I do love Sleeping Beauty.
She was my favorite.
I love Sleeping Beauty. I love the music. I love the art style. I love the story. I still love it to this day. I loved it for different reasons as a kid because there was a knight fighting a dragon. Although I found that very scary as well. But I also, even as a kid, loved when they're changing the color of the dress back and forth. And I loved the magic and the back and forth between the fairy godmothers. But I look at that film now and I understand certain criticism where it's like, oh, Princess Aurora meets a stranger, falls in love with him, and he kisses her and she wakes up and they live happily ever after. Mm-hmm. I totally get the criticism of that.
Yeah.
The way that I take it personally is that these two characters are meant to be together. It is a story that there is a true love out there for you. Mm-hmm. So it's supposed to be that sign of hope. And good will conquer evil. So, and honestly, Princess Aurora, like, I don't know what some people have against her because some people say, oh, she doesn't do anything. It's like, well, she's mind controlled by a witch.
Right.
What would you like her to do, And then she's cursed and literally against her will put into a state of sleep for eternity until true love comes to set her free. Mm-hmm. So in my mind, it's like you just handcuffed your protagonist and now she needs someone to come and rescue her. Of course, people are kind of fed up with that. But people are also fed up with the self-rescuing damsel in distress. I don't need a man. Like, people are getting fed up with that too.
Yeah.
So I guess the way to flip that on its head is like if a knight needs to be saved and so a peasant girl comes in and saves him. That'd be fun to see in a film.
Yeah.
So for The Unnatural Mother, what do you think is the moral of this story? We've talked about what it meant to Charlotte Perkins Gilman back when she wrote it, what she was going through, and what it kind of speaks to women's experience with other women through the decades and even till today. What do you think is the moral of the story?
I think the moral is that a mother should be allowed to do what she feels is right for her children. Mm. I don't know, but this whole time I was reading it, that David Archuleta's new song that came out.
Oh, I haven't heard it.
Where his mother says, if I can't be with you in heaven, then I'll go to hell with you, for you. And I see Esther that way. I think that she died for those villages, and I think she died for her child to go on, and she would have gone to hell or done worse or whatever she needed to for her little girl. I think she was misjudged by the other women.
Because if she had gone to save her child would have died with her rather than giving her child an opportunity to live.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And, it's showing how the criticism of allowing a woman to raise her child by saying it is better for the child to not be with me right now, that is what the story is talking about. It's not talking about anything, outside of that boundary. It reminds me of the times that you've played, what's her name, in next to normal.
Oh, Diana.
Diana, yeah. And how every time I even hear the song, So Anyway.
So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, where she's talking to her husband and she's like, so anyway, I'm leaving. Because, and the lyrics are so beautifully poetic because it says, like, it'll be a struggle and it'll be hard, but I'll be free, and we've been doing this for so long, we've hurt each other. That's the same thing. She's saying, I need to leave to allow my family to be better without me.
Yeah.
And you even had an experience where someone approached you after a show and said that they had experienced that, right?
Yeah.
What was that like? Because you had just played this character who was mentally ill and left their family to allow their family to be better off. And then, what was it, a girl or who came up to you and said that was her experience?
Oh, wow. It's been so many years. I think it was a gentleman that came up and mentioned that
his mother
had to do something like this in this situation, and it just, he just said it really struck home, but it helped him kind of see and understand his mother, and also being older now and talking to him like, well, he was older, an adult, just being grateful for what his mom had sacrificed. And he hadn't understood that when he was younger and she had to go.
Yeah. Well, relating to it personally, I didn't understand what you were sacrificing when I was a kid and you left my birth father. Mm-hmm. I didn't understand. I remember being a little kid and I had dandelions and I was making wishes that my mom and dad would get back together or be happy again, And I just didn't understand it. And I remember you were talking with me when I was like a teenager, and another mom was going through something similar, was going through a divorce, and their child was very hateful of them and threw fits and couldn't understand. And she was looking to you for advice, and you said the most that you can do is love them and wait until they can understand.
Yeah.
And just have patience. Like, that is so hard.
Well, that's what my mother told me in all of this. Like, someday, Tynan will understand the sacrifice. You did. And I was able to share things that I knew at a certain point that I needed to share with you, but I knew I couldn't until you were ready to understand and hear those things.
Is there anything else that you think people can take away from this story now that we're getting back on track?
Take away.
Any other themes or ideas? Any other advice? Any other comparisons?
No, I feel like I went off on all these different tangents with the religious aspect.
Why do you think the women of this story don't question more of what their standard society is doing when it comes to raising children? Like, if Esther, for instance, Esther grew up running around outside, being very active, being in nature. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure that helped her to be able to run to the village in time enough to give them a warning and then run all the way back to try and help her husband. It like seemingly great distances, right? Mm-hmm. So why do you think the women of this story don't ever question or challenge some of the things that they hold to be true? Is it because they're just older and it would be more difficult to do that? Or is it something that goes against their entire identity?
Yeah, I would say that it goes against everything they feel and know and that they've known their whole life. Because when you just feel a certain way, or you've always done things a certain way, it's like, it must be right. Can't be wrong. Other people, it's so hard to see
right
outside, and you automatically find the worst.
Right.
Or think the worst. Not even if you're finding the worst, but you think the worst. Like
like smoking.
Yeah.
Because everyone was a smoker at one point.
Right.
People smoked on planes. But then eventually research came out that showed, hey, you could get cancer from this. Not only that, it could cause other health complications to where you have heart attacks or strokes or anything like that. Then there started being regulations, and people were in an uproar. They're like, oh, what are you doing? No, absolutely. People were in an uproar. They said, how can you take away smoking? Like, oh, I'm pregnant. Smoking helps me relax. How can you take that away from me? It's like, well, you're hurting your baby and you're hurting yourself. So, yeah, there's always an uproar for constancy when there is a progressive change, which is really interesting because you have people who are set in their ways. I remember one time Madison talked about in her ward, there was an announcement given to all of the church that said BYU will now be allowing caffeinated beverages on campus.
Oh, my Lanta.
And an old lady, wonderful, loving old lady, cried and bore her testimony in that meeting, just saying how she thought that the church was losing its values. Are you kidding me?
Sad. I used to have to walk across the campus off campus to get Diet Coke. Yeah.
Really? Wow.
I just can't even believe it's there. It's a miracle. There are miracles. Wow.
Yeah, I guess I just don't know what it takes
It's
for
hard.
social change to happen.
It's hard. And she's, Esther's just one person. And so they can trample her. Like
Right.
She's one person that is being different, making a difference for her family. But society isn't going to allow that.
And that's the thing, is that it takes one person to start leading the charge. And then it takes more than one person for everyone to start to see why that's a good thing. Well, I have no other questions. Do you have any other things you'd like to talk about?
No, I want you to cut everything I said because I feel like I don't know if I'm tired or old or both things, but I'm sure everything I said was just nonsense. And
No, not at all.
But it was fun. It was fun.
Good.
Now
I'm
cut
glad.
All of it. I just like your voice.
I am glad that you had fun. Thank you for coming onto this podcast and doing this episode with me. It means a lot. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Mom, if anyone wants to follow your career or reach you in any way, what are some ways that they can reach you? Do you have an Instagram? Do you have a... No? Okay.
I think I do, but I don't even know what it is.
Oh.
I have Facebook.
Okay.
What is my Instagram?
Oh, it's Sara Mickey D.
Yeah.
So it's SARAMICKYD. That's your Instagram.
Thank you. Your father, Clint, is much better at his Instagram.
Yeah.
And I don't know his either. But anyways, wait, I do. It's Clinton J. McDonald. That's easier to remember.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on to this episode. Listeners, if you would like to know more about her, you can follow her on Instagram. You can also follow this podcast on Instagram at The Poe Show Podcast. And follow on TikTok at Poe Show Podcast. I'm also on Threads if anyone is there, although it kind of it had a big surge and then it kind of fell off. So I don't know where Threads is going to go. You can also find us on the Poe Show YouTube channel or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Apple Music. We're literally everywhere. So yeah, just find us, follow us, and find the podcast, follow the podcast, and share it with other people so that way we can reach more people and just do more content. Send in a suggestion to the Poe Show. We have an email, poeshowpod@gmail.com. Send in a suggestion for a story you'd like to hear or a poem or anything from the 19th century, and I'd love to do it for you guys. Thank you again for coming on, Mom.
I love Edgar Allan Poe, and I love you.
Love you too.
I love you more, though.
Oh, okay. That's good.